So when you were doing it at the time, you were a little bit of a pioneer because you weren't. You had a feeling this was going to work, and you had the kind of a momentum was building, but you weren't absolutely sure, or were you? Were you sure it was going to take you to full recovery?
No, I wasn't. But
Yeah.
what started to happen was, as I started to do this more and more, my pain started changing, and my sensory changes started beginning to become more normal. And the moment I started to notice that my body started changing, I made the immediate association with what was happening inside of me, with what was happening outside of me. And the moment I made that connection, I became very, very passionate. I just knew that I was on to something.
Yeah.
And so I had people come and lay hands on my back, and I had other things going on. I did a lot of different things. But to finish the story, in 10 weeks, 10.5 weeks, I was back on my feet. And
it should have been, what, 6 months to get
3 to 6 months just to stand up if I was lucky.
Yeah.
And then back in my practice in 11 weeks or so, and training again at 12 weeks, and back to my normal life. And during that time, when you're laying there alone a lot, and I have such compassion for people now with disabilities or illnesses. When you're laying there, and you're weighing what you know against what you don't know, or what you're told against what you believe. You think, you make yourself promises. And my promise was that if I was ever able to walk again, if I was ever able to go back to a normal life, that I would spend the rest of my life, studying the concept of the brain and mind, and that's what I've been doing.
Right. And did you go back and see your doctors afterwards? And
I called the medical director of the hospital, and we had a fine conversation, and he was happy. But this was outside of convention. I think that even if I attended a patient who came to my office and I took x-rays and I saw those broken bones, I would consider Harrington rod surgery for them as well. But this was me, and
it was your body.
And it was my body. And so for me, I had to back up and reevaluate everything I knew, and I'm happy that I did.
Absolutely. So you went back to your practice, and then I think after that you studied neuroscience, was that right?
Well, I took a spiritual path. I took a strong spiritual path, and I think what's happening in the contemporary world right now is that there's a merging of traditional spiritual texts with scientific information, because our research is getting so good and our instrumentation and our technology is improving, that I think that presently science is becoming the new language of the spiritual realm in the non-religious sense. And so you can't study spirituality at this point without having an interest in finding out what's going on in the brain, the mind, and consciousness. So that led me into a very strong interest in what happens in the brain and what's the subconscious mind and the conscious mind. And so, I started, in my spiritual quest, I started studying people who had spontaneous remissions of diseases. And I wanted 10 years worth of accumulating data. And when I started studying that information and making the connection now.
So you actually have this data, do you?
Oh, yeah.
That would make a great book.
It's in Evolve. It's the second chapter of Evolve.
Yeah.
That there were 4 common principles that they had that after my interviews.
Yeah.
And so I had to go back to school and learn neuroscience, because it was the most operable and practical explanation to bring it to the most simple, common ways for people to begin to apply to their own life.
Right. Yeah. The 4 principles, you mentioned these 4 principles actually in a DVD I watched the other night.
Mm-hmm.
Do you want to just go through the 4 basic principles?
Well, it makes total sense. When people have a disease, they can't go on business as usual. You can't keep your social agreements, and you don't do the things you typically do because, first of all, you're uncomfortable. Second of all, you're worried about your own mortality. And so people a lot of times turn inward. It's a common phenomenon. The first thing they had in common is they all believed that there was a spiritual aspect within them, that something was giving them life, and that, again, just like me, if they could connect with that intelligence and give it some direction or give it some order and develop a relationship with it, even though you can't see it or taste it or feel it or hear it, but it's alive, right? Because it is life. And then surrender. Plant the seed and then surrender it and give up your worry and fear and know that this mind would begin to work for you. That was the first thing they had in common. Second thing was that they began to realize that their 20 years of hatred and their 10 years of pain and suffering and their 30 years of anger towards their father or whatever emotion that they had memorized was really the reason for their disease, that it was that strong emotion that they lived by every single day that was killing them, and they had to break the habit of being themselves. They had to forgive, and they had to let go and unlearn some emotions that they had memorized that became part of their personality.
You see, people would say, well, a lot of it is genetic. It's fact that, they got some disease because their father had it, their grandfather had it.
That's true, it is genetic, but they used to say that it was genes that caused disease. And then 25 years ago, Ian, they said, well, no, it's the environment that pushes the genetic buttons that cause disease. Now we're saying it's the internal environment that is affected by the external environment that pushes the genetic buttons that cause disease. Because why is it that two factory workers can work side by side, exposed to a carcinogenic chemical in the factory? One gets cancer and the other doesn't. Surely there must be some internal order there that allows that to take place. So, there is a genetic component, but what turns the genes on is the question.
Yeah, they're going to be more easily turned on possibly in some people than others, and people a little more sensitive.
Well, the latest research presently shows that anger, aggression, fear, anxiety, pain, suffering, those survival states dysregulate and downregulate the genes to create disease. Now, the question is, if we know that we can turn on those states just by thought alone, if our thoughts make us sick, is it possible that our thoughts can make us well? And there's research now that's beginning to show that, in fact, there's a way to do that. And so these people began to realize that their thoughts and feelings and the cycle of thinking and feeling and feeling and thinking, the redundancy of the same emotion kept pushing the same genetic button that created disease. Now, they didn't say it that way. What they said was, I'm killing myself over something that for the last 20 years, this hatred or this anger hasn't done anything but hurt myself. And so they began to look at how they could change that. So that was the second thing they had in common. A profound moment, because that surrendering process is saying, I no longer want to be the same person I was.
They get fed up with it, basically, don't they?
Yeah, you reach a point where your back is against the wall and you say, I'm going to die if I keep this up.
Yeah.
Now, these people, by the way, a lot of them were taking medications and doing therapies, and they were either staying the same or they were getting worse. So they knew that they were headed down a track where they had to all of a sudden get serious and rethink a lot of things. Now, the third thing they had in common, which I thought was one of the most fascinating, was that they said to themselves, now that I've surrendered this part of myself, I want to reinvent myself. How would a happy person be? What would I have to do to be happy? How would I have to think? What would I have to change about myself to be in joy? Who do I know in my life that I want to be like? They started to ask themselves some profound questions, and they were smart enough to wait for the answers. Instead of turning on the TV or getting on the cell phone or doing what we typically do to distract us, they sat down and they contemplated, how would I have to be? And as they began to answer the question, what they didn't know was happening was that they were changing their brain and their mind just by thinking differently. They were forcing the brain to fire in new sequences and new patterns and new combinations. And whenever we make the brain work differently, we're making a new mind. Mind is the brain in action or the brain at work. So they were beginning to change their mind.